I never thought I would sit before others and share this part of my life. As a nun, I am often expected to be a symbol of serenity, discipline, and unwavering faith. People look at me and my habit and imagine a life filled only with prayer, kindness, and peace. But behind the quiet smile I wear today is a story of wounds, fear, and a rebellion that changed the course of my soul. What I'm about to tell you is not easy, and for many years I believed I would carry it in silence until my last breath. Yet as the seasons of life pass and I grow older, I have come to see that silence protects the wrong people. Silence allows abuse to thrive, and silence suffocates the truth. When I was a child, I believed convent life was a holy shelter. My family was devout, and after my mother passed away when I was still very young, my father decided the convent was the safest place for me to grow in faith and discipline. I remember clutching his hand tightly as we walked up the stone steps of the convent for the first time. The towering chapel seemed to touch the heavens themselves. Candles flickered in the hallways. The air smelled of wax and old wood. I believed I had stepped into a piece of heaven on earth. The woman who greeted us that day was the Mother Superior. She was tall, commanding, and carried herself with such authority that even my father bowed his head slightly when she spoke. She told us that here I would learn discipline, holiness, and purpose. She promised to raise me as if I were her own. My father looked relieved, and I felt a mixture of fear and awe. To me, she was not only the leader of the convent, but the figure of a mother I had just lost. In her presence, I thought I would be safe. Those early days seemed peaceful enough. I was taught prayers, hymns, and the rhythm of convent life. Dawn bells would ring, and we girls would shuffle into the chapel half awake, our small voices rising together in sacred song. There were moments of joy, playing in the courtyard under the watchful gaze of the sisters, learning how to sew altar cloths, whispering stories to each other after lights out. I believed then that God had chosen this path for me, and that my grief over my mother's death was being soothed by this new spiritual family. But innocence has a way of blinding us to the shadows that lurk in sacred places. At first, the Mother Superior seemed strict but fair. She corrected us when we forgot our chores, insisted on neatness in our writing, and reminded us that obedience was a holy virtue. I accepted this, even admired it, for I wanted nothing more than to please her. But over time, her strictness began to change into something darker. Her gaze lingered too long on our mistakes, her punishments grew sharper, and her tone carried not only authority, but cruelty. I will never forget the first time I felt the sting of her cane across my hands. I had spilled a small cup of water while cleaning the refectory. It was such a minor accident, yet she pulled me aside, her face stern, her eyes cold. She said nothing about forgiveness, only that weakness must be beaten out before it becomes rebellion. The cane cracked against my palms until they burned and swelled, and I bit my lip to keep from crying out. When she finally dismissed me, she whispered, "This is God's way of making you stronger." I believed her. I was a child, desperate to trust, desperate to belong. That was the beginning of my confusion. How could pain be holy? How could cruelty be the language of God? But I did not question her out loud. I swallowed my tears and bowed my head. Years later, I would understand that was how she gained control, by teaching us to equate suffering with sanctity, obedience with silence. She turned her authority into a weapon, and I was too young to see it clearly. Still, even in those early months, something inside me began to tremble with unease. At night, I prayed not only for my mother's soul, but for my own protection. I prayed that God would see my heart and forgive me if I was too weak to endure. And I prayed that someday I would understand why the woman I trusted as a second mother had begun to treat me not as a daughter of God, but as an enemy to be broken. As I tell this story now, many decades later, I can still hear the echo of those prayers in my mind. I can still see the faces of the girls beside me, some too frightened to meet my eyes, others silently enduring as I did. And I can still feel the heavy weight of fear every time her footsteps echoed down the stone corridors. This is not just a story about pain, it is about survival. It is about how rebellion, something I once thought was sinful, became the act that saved my life. But before I can speak of rebellion, I must first take you into the heart of those years of silence and cruelty. I must show you how a child's faith can be twisted into chains and how even in the house of God, darkness can find a way to hide. So stay with me. Listen closely. What I reveal next may be hard to hear, but it is the truth of how I became the nun I am today. When I first arrived at the convent, I was still just a girl longing for the warmth of a family I had lost too soon. My father had done what he thought was best after my mother's passing. He believed the convent would raise me in faith, discipline, and security. In those first months, I clung to that belief as tightly as I clutched my rosary. The convent itself was a world of rituals and order. The mornings began before dawn, when the bell rang across the stone halls. Its sound was both gentle and commanding, urging us from our narrow beds into the chapel for prayer. I remember shuffling through the corridors with the other girls, our slippers brushing the cold stone floors, our eyes still heavy with sleep. Yet when the hymns rose into the air, something inside me always lifted, as if my voice was floating straight to heaven. During those years, I learned more than just prayers. The sisters taught us reading, writing, mathematics, and music. I found joy in simple things, tracing letters on rough parchment, kneeling to light candles before the Virgin statue, or listening to the choir's voices echo through the chapel. Sometimes we were given tasks in the kitchen or garden, and I loved the smell of fresh bread rising or the sight of sunlit herbs swaying in the courtyard. In those small, ordinary tasks, I felt useful, connected to the rhythm of a sacred life. The other girls became my companions, my new sisters in spirit. We whispered to one another in the evenings when the lamps burned low, sharing dreams and fears. Some of them came from faraway towns. Others had lost parents as I had, and a few had been sent by families too poor to feed them. Despite our different stories, we shared one thing. We all looked to the nuns for guidance and care, and among them, none was more revered than the Mother Superior. In the beginning, I admired her deeply. She carried herself with such certainty, such authority, that it was easy to mistake fear for respect. When she passed through the halls, her veil seemed to move like a shadow of God's will itself. The sisters obeyed her without question, and we children did the same. She was the figure we measured ourselves against, the one who could either grant approval or deliver punishment. To me, still fragile from my mother's death, she became the figure I longed to please, the woman I believed would protect and guide me. There were moments when she seemed almost kind. Once, when I had been crying quietly after prayers, she rested her hand on my shoulder and told me that suffering brings us closer to Christ. At the time, I thought those words meant comfort. I thought she understood my grief. I did not yet see how she used such phrases as tools, bending faith into justification for cruelty. But before those shadows overtook my life, there were still days of light. I remember feast days when the chapel was filled with flowers and the smell of incense curled through the air like ribbons of smoke. We children sang until our voices cracked, and afterward we were given sweet rolls or fruit. For a brief moment, laughter returned to my lips, and I felt as if perhaps this place truly was my sanctuary. There were evenings, too, when the convent garden became our playground. The older nuns would allow us a short time to walk among the roses before supper. I would trace my fingers over the petals, imagining my mother's gentle touch, and whisper prayers into the twilight sky. In those moments I felt close to heaven, as though God still listened. Looking back now, I realize how desperately I wanted to believe in the goodness of that world. I wrapped myself in its rituals, convincing myself that structure meant safety. I longed for approval, for belonging, and so I ignored the unease that occasionally stirred inside me when the Mother Superior's eyes lingered too long or her tone sharpened with unusual harshness. It is strange how a child's heart can cling to hope even as danger begins to creep closer. I saw discipline and mistook it for love. I heard scripture twisted into commands and mistook it for truth. I believed that if I only prayed harder, worked harder, and obeyed more perfectly, then I would finally be safe, finally be worthy. But deep down, the first cracks were forming. There were nights when I lay awake, listening to her footsteps echo in the corridors, and a chill spread through me, though I did not know why. There were times when other girls returned from private meetings with her in tears, but we all said nothing, convincing ourselves that it must be for the good of our souls. Silence became our unwritten rule. Those early years now feel like the fragile calm before a storm. They were filled with half-truths and illusions, enough warmth to keep us bound, enough fear to keep us silent. And at the center of it all stood the woman we had been taught to revere, the woman I would one day see not as a protector, but as my tormentor. At that time, however, I still believed in her. I still believed that the convent was holy ground, that obedience would shield me from harm. I had not yet discovered the darker truth, that sometimes the hands which bless can also be the hands which break. The moment of betrayal did not come with thunder or lightning. It came quietly, almost disguised as ordinary discipline. That is perhaps what made it so painful. One evening, I was assigned to clean the refectory after supper. It was a simple task, one I had done many times before, collecting plates, sweeping crumbs, and wiping the long wooden tables. I remember humming softly to myself, trying to make the work pass faster. My hands were tired, but my heart was light enough. And then I spilled a small cup of water. It was such a small mistake, a drop slipping from my hand, spreading across the wood. I rushed to wipe it before anyone could notice, but the sound of her footsteps stopped me cold. The Mother Superior entered the room, her eyes immediately falling on the wet table. She asked no questions, offered no chance for explanation. Her gaze pierced me as though my clumsy hands had committed a sin too great to forgive. "Carelessness is rebellion," she said, her voice low and sharp. Before I could answer, she ordered me to hold out my hands. I obeyed, trembling, unsure what was to come. From beneath her habit, she pulled the thin cane she often carried, and before I could draw breath, it struck across my palms. The sting was immediate, searing, a pain that shot through my arms and made my knees buckle. I gasped, but did not scream. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted blood, determined not to show weakness. But the cane came down again and again, each strike sharper than the last. Tears filled my eyes until the room blurred. I wanted to beg her to stop, but fear sealed my lips. When at last she lowered the cane, she leaned close and whispered, "This is God's way of purifying you. Do not forget." I stumbled back to my dormitory that night with swollen hands, cradling them against my chest. The other girls looked at me with wide eyes, but said nothing. We all understood the unspoken rule. Silence was survival. I hid my tears under the thin blanket, telling myself it was a lesson, that somehow the pain had meaning. Yet deep inside, something cracked. The punishments became more frequent after that. Each time I made even the smallest mistake, misplacing a book, forgetting a line of prayer, leaving dust on a windowsill, her wrath descended. At first I thought it was only me. Perhaps I was truly clumsy, truly weak, truly deserving of correction. But soon I noticed the pattern. Her cruelty found its way to others too. A girl named Teresa once missed a note during choir practice, and afterward she returned to the dormitory with red marks across her arms. Another girl, Ruth, was caught whispering after lights out. The next morning she could hardly walk. We never spoke of it directly, but our silence was heavy with shared fear. The Mother Superior had taught us that to question her was to question God, and so we turned our fear inward. We convinced ourselves that obedience was holy, that our suffering was chosen by heaven itself. Yet I could not silence the questions in my heart. Why would God allow his servant to wound his children? Why would a woman who claimed to love us break us so often? I prayed for answers, kneeling on cold stone until my knees ached, whispering my confusion into the darkness. No answer came. Only the echo of her words. that pain was purification. The worst part was not only the physical pain, but the way it twisted my thoughts. Every time she raised the cane, I wondered if I was truly wicked, if perhaps God himself despised me. I began to shrink into myself, speaking less, avoiding laughter, hiding behind silence. Joy felt dangerous, mistakes inevitable. One afternoon, after another punishment, I caught sight of myself in a small mirror in the dormitory. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, and for the first time I did not recognize the girl staring back at me. She was no longer a child filled with song and hope. She was a shadow, bent under fear. I remember whispering to my reflection, "Is this what God wants of me? To be broken?" It was the first time I dared to let doubt slip past my lips, the first time the seed of rebellion stirred in my heart, though I did not yet understand it. Still, outwardly I obeyed. I bowed my head in chapel, I folded my hands neatly in prayer, I smiled when commanded. But inside, the silence grew heavier, the questions louder, the wounds deeper. The first betrayal was not simply the crack of a cane, it was the shattering of trust. The woman I had once seen as my protector, the mother I thought God had given me after my own mother's death, had shown herself to be something else entirely. She was no longer a guardian, she was my tormentor. That night, as I lay awake in my narrow bed, I made a vow to myself, though I was only a child, one day somehow I would speak. One day I would no longer bow my head in silence. One day I would tell the truth. After that first true punishment, silence became the air I breathed. I learned to keep my voice soft, my steps careful, and my thoughts hidden. The Mother Superior had a way of watching us that made me feel as though she could see straight through skin and bone into the trembling heart beneath. Her eyes were cold, sharp, and filled with an authority that demanded obedience. Each day followed the same routine: morning bells, prayers, lessons, chores, evening mass, then sleep. But for me, every sound of her footsteps in the hallway was a warning. I began to shape my life around avoiding her notice. If I worked quickly, she said I was rushing. If I worked slowly, she said I was lazy. No matter what I did, her judgment fell. At first, I told myself that these punishments were lessons from God, as she claimed. She reminded me again and again that pain was purification, that my soul would be made clean through suffering. When the cane struck my hands, when her palm struck my cheek, when her voice sliced through the air like a blade, I tried to believe she was right. But each time, something inside me broke a little more. The other girls carried their own silence too. I could see it in the way they avoided her eyes, the way they whispered prayers under their breath even outside the chapel. Once, a younger girl named Miriam cried softly at night after she had been beaten for forgetting a verse of scripture. I reached across the narrow space between our beds and held her hand under the blankets. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Our silence spoke enough. But silence is not peace. Silence is fear disguised as obedience, and fear began to seep into every corner of my life. I stopped laughing. I stopped singing during chores, though I had once loved to hum hymns as I worked. Even my prayers changed. Instead of asking God for joy or understanding, I begged Him only for protection. "Please let her pass me by today," I whispered on my knees. "Please keep her eyes away from me." The Mother Superior's cruelty grew sharper as months passed. She had a way of twisting our faith into chains. "Christ suffered without complaint," she told us. "You must do the same. If you cry, it is because your heart is still proud. If you resist, it is because you are still sinful." Her words burrowed into my mind like thorns. I began to believe that my pain was proof of my weakness. I tried once, timidly, to speak to another sister about it. Sister Agnes was gentle, the kind of woman who smiled often and tended the garden with care. One afternoon, when she found me scrubbing the floors with swollen hands, she paused and frowned. "Child, what happened to you?" she asked softly. For a moment, my lips trembled with the truth. I wanted to cry out, to tell her everything, to beg her to protect me. But the memory of the Mother Superior's threats filled my head. If I spoke, would anyone believe me? Or would they say I was rebellious, disobedient, unworthy of God's house? So I shook my head and forced a smile. "It is nothing, sister. I fell." Her eyes lingered on me with doubt, but she said nothing more. That silence crushed me more than words could. It proved what I already feared, that no one could save me. In time, I began to change my behavior in desperate attempts to disappear. I wore my clothes looser so my bruises would not show. I avoided eye contact in chapel, keeping my head bowed so low that my neck ached. I answered questions in lessons with the shortest possible words, fearing that any mistake would invite punishment. The other girls noticed, though they did not dare comment. They kept their distance, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. To be too close to me was dangerous. The Mother Superior always found fault in those who shared my company. I became a shadow among them, present but untouchable. In those long months, I began to doubt myself in every way. Perhaps I was the problem. Perhaps my clumsiness, my weakness, my sins had drawn her wrath. When she called me disobedient, I believed her. When she said I was unworthy, I accepted it. Slowly, I began to carry her voice inside me until it became indistinguishable from my own. But at night, when I lay awake in the darkness, I still prayed. I prayed that God would see me, that He would know my heart, even if the Mother Superior declared me wicked. I prayed for strength, for deliverance, though I did not know how or when it could ever come. Those silent prayers became my only rebellion in those days. I dared not speak against her, but in my heart I whispered to heaven the truth I could not say aloud, that what she did was wrong, that pain was not the same as holiness, that cruelty was not the same as love. Even so, the silence grew heavier. Day after day, year after year, I carried it like a weight across my chest. Silence kept me alive, but it also slowly suffocated me. It turned me into a ghost of the child I had once been, and though I did not yet know it, silence could not last forever. Sooner or later, truth always demands a voice. Silence can only stretch so far before something inside begins to crack. For a long time, I convinced myself I could endure, that if I prayed harder, obeyed more perfectly, and accepted each blow with bowed head, then perhaps one day the punishments would end. But suffering has a way of piling upon itself, and my body, like my spirit, could not bear the weight forever. It was in the cold months of one particular year when my breaking point arrived. The stone halls of the convent were always drafty, but that winter seemed especially cruel. My hands were raw from endless chores, the skin split and bleeding from scrubbing stone floors with icy water. My body had grown thinner, my appetite almost gone. Yet I dared not complain. Complaining was rebellion, and rebellion was sin. At least that was what the Mother Superior had drilled into us. One evening, as I carried a heavy pail across the courtyard, I stumbled. The water sloshed out, soaking my dress and spilling across the stones. Before I could gather myself, her shadow fell over me. She did not speak at first. She only looked down with that sharp, cold gaze, and I felt smaller than a child. Then, without warning, her hand struck my cheek so hard I saw sparks before my eyes. "Clumsy," she hissed. "Ungrateful. You waste what you are given." She ordered me to fetch another pail and start again. I obeyed, but my legs trembled beneath me. That night, I lay awake with my face swollen, the sting burning deeper than the skin. Something inside me whispered that I could not survive many more days like this. The punishments grew harsher as the months dragged on. Once, for failing to remember a long passage of scripture, I was forced to kneel on the stone floor for hours, my arms raised until they shook. When they fell, she struck me with her cane until I lifted them again. By the time she dismissed me, my knees were bruised and my arms hung limp at my sides. I could barely rise from the floor. I began to lose more than weight. I lost the small fragments of joy that had once given me strength. I no longer found comfort in the hymns that once lifted my heart. I no longer saw beauty in the candles or the gardens. The world became gray, stripped of color, drowned in fear. Other girls noticed. Some tried to slip me extra bread during meals. One, the same Miriam who had cried quietly that night, brushed my hair for me when my arms ached too much to lift the comb. These small kindnesses were sparks in the darkness, but they were not enough to keep me whole. My health began to falter. Dull headaches haunted me, fevers came and went, and often I grew dizzy just standing in chapel. I remember one morning when I fainted during prayer, collapsing onto the cold floor. I woke to the sharp sting of water thrown on my face and the Mother Superior's harsh voice. "Weakness is sin," she said. "Do not shame this house again." It was then I realized she would never show mercy. To her, suffering was not a symptom, but a tool. She did not see my failing health as a warning sign, but as another chance to press me deeper into silence. And yet, even in that suffocating darkness, a thread of hope appeared. Sister Agnes, the gentle one, began to notice more. When she passed me in the corridor, her eyes lingered on my pale face. One afternoon, when she found me struggling to lift a basket of laundry, she touched my shoulder gently. "Child, you cannot go on like this," she whispered. For the first time, her words carried more than pity. They carried concern. I wanted to tell her everything. My throat ached with the urge to cry out, to say, "She is hurting us. She is breaking us." But fear locked my voice once again. Instead, I shook my head and carried on. Still, her kindness lingered with me that night, and for the first time in many months, I felt a spark of something other than despair. But sparks alone could not save me. The breaking point came soon after. One evening, after a particularly cruel punishment for a mistake I still cannot remember, my body gave out. My vision blurred, my chest ached, and when I tried to rise from the floor, my legs refused. I collapsed in the corridor, the stone icy against my cheek. I remember hearing distant voices, the other girls gasping, the hurried steps of a sister running for help. The world spun, and all I could think was a single prayer. "Lord, take me, or deliver me." When I awoke, I was not in my bed, but in the infirmary, a small whitewashed room with clean sheets and the faint smell of herbs. A doctor, not from the convent, but from the nearby town, was leaning over me. His voice was gentle but firm as he told me I needed rest, nourishment, and care. My body, he said, had been pushed beyond its limits. The Mother Superior stood nearby, her face unreadable. She claimed I had overworked myself, that my collapse was due to lack of discipline. But the doctor's eyes narrowed as he studied me. He did not believe her completely. I could see it in his gaze. For the first time, I sensed that perhaps someone outside these walls might see the truth. Still, I remained silent. Even in that moment, lying weak and broken, I feared her wrath more than I trusted the world beyond. I told myself it was only exhaustion, nothing more, and so the truth remained hidden a little longer. But deep in my heart I knew this. Silence had nearly killed me. And one day, if I did not find the courage to speak, it surely would. Lying in the infirmary after my collapse, I felt a strange mix of shame and relief. For the first time in so long, I was allowed to rest. Clean sheets replaced the cold stone floor. A gentle sister brought me broth, urging me to sip slowly. My body was weak, but for a few days I felt shielded from her, the woman whose shadow had haunted every corner of my life. But shadows have a way of finding you. The town doctor visited twice. He was a stern man with gray hair and eyes that missed very little. Each time he examined me, he looked at my bruises, my thin frame, the way I winced when I moved. He asked questions in a careful tone. "How did you come to have these marks? Did you fall? Were you struck?" His eyes lingered on mine, waiting for truth. I wanted so badly to tell him. The words trembled at the edge of my lips, but then I would feel her presence near the doorway, her gaze heavy on my back. The Mother Superior never left me alone for long. If the doctor asked me directly, she would stand behind him, arms folded, her expression daring me to speak. Fear sealed my throat, so I lied. "I tripped on the stone steps," I whispered. "I am clumsy." The doctor frowned, unconvinced, but wrote nothing more than exhaustion and malnutrition on his notes. When he left, she leaned down close to me. Her voice was soft enough that only I could hear. "Weakness will not protect you, child," she said. "Remember your vow of obedience." The threat was clear, though she spoke in the language of holiness. After a week, my strength returned little by little, and I was sent back to my duties. But things were not the same. Whispers had begun among the sisters. My collapse had drawn attention. Some said I worked too hard. Others suspected more, though no one dared voice it openly. I felt their eyes on me when I walked through the halls. Pity is almost as heavy as fear. One evening, Sister Agnes came to me again. She sat on the edge of my narrow bed, her hands folded tightly as though in prayer. "Child," she said gently, "something is wrong here. I see it in your eyes, in the way you shrink from her presence. You do not need to carry this burden alone. God values truth as much as obedience." Her words broke something inside me. Tears slid down my face, but even then I shook my head. The fear of punishment, of being branded rebellious, chained my tongue. "It is nothing, sister," I said, though the sobs betrayed me. She squeezed my hand, her eyes full of sorrow. "When the time comes," she whispered, "God will give you the courage to speak." That night I lay awake replaying her words. Courage. It felt like a word from another language, something I had long forgotten. But fate, or perhaps providence, was moving. The doctor, unsatisfied with my silence, had spoken quietly with one of the parish priests. Soon, an investigator sent by the diocese arrived at the convent. He was a tall man with kind eyes who asked to speak with several of the girls, myself included. I remember sitting across from him in a small room, the crucifix hanging above us, my heart pounding so loudly I thought he could hear it. He asked careful questions. "Are you treated well here? Do you feel safe? Have you ever been harmed?" My mouth went dry. The truth pressed at my chest, aching to be released. But then I thought of the Mother Superior's cold eyes, her hand gripping the cane, her voice whispering that pain was purification. I thought of her warning in the infirmary. And once again, I lied. "I am cared for," I said. "The punishments are only discipline, nothing more." Even as I spoke, I hated myself for the words, but fear was stronger than shame. The investigator studied me for a long moment, as though he could see the truth hiding beneath my silence. At last, he sighed and dismissed me. I walked back to the dormitory with my knees shaking. I had been given a chance to break free, and I had let it slip away. Later that evening, she called me to her chambers. The room smelled of incense and wax, the crucifix looming large on the wall. She closed the door behind me, and her voice was calm, almost gentle. "You were wise today," she said. "The church does not look kindly on liars. Had you spoken falsely, it would have been your soul that suffered. Remember this: obedience saves, rebellion destroys." Her words wrapped around me like chains. She had turned even my silence into a twisted kind of loyalty. But though she believed she had secured her power, cracks were beginning to form. The other girls had noticed too much. My bruises, my fainting, my silence, these were not things that could be hidden forever. Even some of the younger sisters exchanged uneasy glances when she entered the chapel. And Sister Agnes, steadfast and patient, never stopped watching me with those eyes that held both sorrow and hope. For me, denial had become survival. Each time the opportunity arose to tell the truth, I swallowed it back. I told myself that keeping silent was better than inviting more pain. Yet inside, I felt the weight growing heavier, pressing against my chest, threatening to suffocate me. One evening after Compline prayers, I looked at the flickering candles and whispered a prayer of my own. Lord, if you want me to speak, give me the courage, because I no longer know how. I did not yet realize it, but the moment of exposure was drawing closer. My silence had lasted for years, but truth has a way of rising, no matter how hard it is buried. The days following the investigator's visit were heavy with tension. Though he had left without answers, his presence had unsettled the air of the convent. The Mother Superior moved through the halls with even greater severity, her eyes scanning us as though she could read our thoughts. For me, each passing moment felt like walking on a tightrope, knowing one misstep could send me crashing into ruin. But whispers cannot be silenced forever. Among the girls, the murmurs grew louder. They noticed the way I flinched when her shadow passed near me. They saw the bruises I tried to hide, the way I avoided her gaze, the hollowness in my eyes. Some pitied me, others kept their distance, but all knew that something was deeply wrong. It was Sister Agnes who confronted me once more. One afternoon, she found me in the chapel, kneeling before the statue of the Virgin. My lips moved in silent prayer, but my heart was a storm. She knelt beside me and whispered, "Child, this cannot go on. You are wasting away. God does not ask his children to be broken like this." Tears burned my eyes, but fear sealed my tongue. Still, she placed her hand over mine and pressed gently. "When the moment comes," she said, "do not be afraid. Truth is not rebellion, it is salvation." Her words lingered like a small flame in the darkness. Not long after, a confrontation erupted that would change everything. It was a cold morning, the kind when the stone walls seemed to steal the warmth from our bones. I had been tasked with sweeping the corridors, my hands still stiff from the chill. I moved slowly, the broom dragging more than it swept. Suddenly, the Mother Superior's voice thundered behind me. "Lazy child, always defiant, always weak." She snatched the broom from my hands and struck it against the floor. "Is this how you serve God, with half-hearted effort?" I bowed my head, murmuring an apology, but she was not satisfied. She ordered me to kneel on the cold stones, arms raised in penance. My body trembled with exhaustion, but I obeyed. Minutes dragged into an hour. My arms burned, my knees throbbed, my breath came in shallow gasps. When at last my arms faltered and fell, she lifted the cane. Before the first blow landed, I felt a shift in the air. Voices rose behind us. Several sisters had gathered at the end of the corridor, their faces pale with horror. Among them was Sister Agnes. She stepped forward quickly. "Mother, enough," she said firmly. "This child cannot bear more. You will kill her." For a moment, silence froze the hall. The Mother Superior's face darkened, and she turned slowly toward Agnes. "Do you dare question my authority?" she hissed. "Yes," Sister Agnes answered, her voice steady. "Because this is not discipline. This is cruelty." My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. Never before had anyone spoken against her so directly. The other sisters shifted uneasily, some lowering their eyes, others staring in open defiance. The Mother Superior's hand trembled on the cane, her composure cracking. She turned her gaze back to me. "Speak, child," she demanded. "Tell them the truth. Tell them you are rebellious, that you need correction." I opened my mouth, but no sound came. My body shook, torn between fear and the faint glimmer of hope. Sister Agnes moved closer, her eyes locking onto mine. "You do not need to protect her," she whispered. "Speak, and you will not be alone." The words echoed in my heart. For years, silence had been my prison. Now, for the first time, a door stood open. With a trembling voice, barely more than a whisper, I said, "She hurts me. She has always hurt me." The words fell into the cold air like stones into water, rippling through the silence. The sisters gasped. Some covered their mouths, others clasped their rosaries tightly. The Mother Superior's face drained of color, then flushed red with fury. "Lies," she spat. "She is weak, and weakness always lies." But I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. "No, it is the truth." For a moment, everything seemed to collapse into chaos. The Mother Superior lunged toward me, her cane raised high, but two of the younger sisters stepped forward and blocked her path. "No more," one of them said firmly. "We have seen enough." The cane fell from her hand, clattering against the stone floor. Her power, so long unchallenged, flickered in that moment. She glared at me with eyes that blazed with hatred, but I no longer lowered my gaze. For the first time, I met her eyes and did not flinch. I had spoken. The silence was broken. That night, the convent buzzed with unease. Some of the sisters whispered prayers, others argued in hushed tones. The Mother Superior locked herself in her chambers, refusing to join evening prayers. I lay in my narrow bed, heart still pounding, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. And though fear still coiled in my chest, another feeling stirred within me, something I had not felt in years. A spark of rebellion, yes, but also the faintest glimmer of freedom. The night after I spoke, the truth was restless. Sleep evaded me, my heart still echoing with the weight of those words I had never dared to utter. The silence of the dormitory felt charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. I knew the Mother Superior would not allow my defiance to go unanswered. She thrived on control, and I had cracked the foundation of her authority with a whisper. At dawn, the convent bells rang as always, but the atmosphere was different. Whispers followed me like shadows as I walked through the corridor. Some sisters looked at me with quiet compassion, while others turned away, afraid of being seen as allies. Fear still ruled here, but something in me had shifted. I no longer carried only dread. I carried the memory of my own voice. That morning, the Mother Superior entered the refectory with her usual commanding presence, but I could see the stiffness in her posture. Her eyes searched the room until they locked on me. She announced that discipline must be restored and ordered me to stand before everyone. My body trembled, but I rose. This time, however, I refused to lower my gaze. "Confess your rebellion," she demanded. "Repent, and perhaps you will be forgiven." The room was so silent I could hear the distant drip of water echoing from the stone walls. My lips parted, and instead of the confession she expected, I spoke the truth again, louder this time. "You have broken me for years. This is not God's will. This is cruelty." Gasps erupted. A spoon clattered against the floor. Several sisters crossed themselves as though my words carried danger. The Mother Superior's face twisted in rage. "Silence!" she bellowed, but her command no longer had the power it once did. From the corner of the room, Sister Agnes stood. She walked forward, her voice steady yet gentle. "She speaks the truth. We have all seen it. To deny it is to deny what God places before our very eyes." Her words were a spark to dry tinder. One by one, hesitant voices rose. "Yes, I saw her strike. Yes, I heard her cries." The murmurs grew louder, gathering strength, until it was no longer one frightened child against a tyrant, but a chorus of voices rising in defiance. The Mother Superior's composure crumbled. She slammed her hand against the table, but the sisters did not fall silent. Their voices grew bolder, fueled by years of suppressed fear and pain. The rebellion was not only mine anymore, it belonged to all of us. In desperation, she tried to invoke the sacred order of obedience, quoting scripture, declaring that resistance was sin. But the words rang hollow. I stepped forward, my knees shaking, but my voice clear. God does not ask us to suffer abuse in His name. He asks us to live in truth. I will no longer bow to fear. It was the first time I had ever stood taller than her in spirit, and though my body quivered, I felt a strength flowing through me that was not mine alone. It was born of every tear, every bruise, every whispered prayer in the dark. The sisters rallied around me, some physically placing themselves between her and me. In that moment, the power she had wielded for years dissolved. She screamed that we would all burn for our rebellion, but her threats were desperate, stripped of their former weight. Later that day, the bishop was summoned. It was Sister Agnes who wrote the letter, slipping it past the Mother Superior's control. When he arrived, I expected him to dismiss me as weak or deluded, but he listened. The testimonies of the other sisters, offered with trembling voices, carried weight. For the first time, her authority was questioned by someone she could not silence. The investigation that followed was slow, but the rebellion had already begun in our hearts. No longer did we scurry at the sound of her footsteps. No longer did silence smother our voices. Even before any judgment was passed, she had lost the very thing she prized most, our obedience. For me, the rebellion was not a single shout or act of defiance. It was the choice to live in truth, day after day, even when fear clawed at me. It was looking her in the eye and refusing to crumble. It was choosing to believe that God's love was not measured by the weight of a cane, but by the freedom of truth. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed, I whispered a prayer not of desperation, but of gratitude. Gratitude for Sister Agnes, for the courage of those who had spoken, and for the quiet strength that had finally taken root inside me. The battle was not over, but I was no longer a voiceless victim. I was a rebel, against cruelty, against fear, against the chains that had bound me for so many years. And deep within, I felt the stirrings of something even greater than rebellion, the beginnings of freedom. When the echoes of our rebellion finally faded, the convent felt like a battlefield after the clash of armies. Silence hung heavy, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of uncertainty, of waiting for what would follow. I knew the hardest part was not standing up to the Mother Superior, but living in the space that followed defiance. The bishop's presence had shaken her hold. He walked the cloisters with slow, deliberate steps, speaking to sisters in hushed tones. His gaze lingered on me more than once, not with accusation, but with a searching sorrow. I wondered if he had ever imagined such cruelty could fester behind convent walls, hidden beneath hymns and rosaries. Perhaps he had turned a blind eye before. Perhaps my words forced him to look at what he could no longer deny. The Mother Superior, stripped of her aura of invincibility, still tried to command the old order. She barked instructions in the chapel, raised her voice in the refectory, but fewer and fewer sisters responded. Each act of resistance, an ignored command, a head held high, was a nail driven into the coffin of her authority. For me, the aftermath was a storm of emotions. I felt relief, pride, even joy that my truth was finally spoken. Yet, woven through those feelings was fear. What if they dismissed me after all? What if the bishop decided to protect her reputation over our pain? I had risked everything by speaking, and now I waited, suspended between freedom and ruin. In those days, I spent long hours in the chapel. The candles flickered, shadows danced across the stone walls, and I whispered prayers not of obedience, but of clarity. Lord, if you hear me, let justice come, not for me alone, but for all of us who suffered. Sometimes I felt his presence like a soft light pressing against my heart. Other times, I felt only the echo of my own voice. The sisters who had supported me grew bolder. In the evenings, small groups gathered in corners, no longer to whisper in fear, but to plan how to move forward. We spoke of healing, of how to restore our home into a place of faith rather than terror. Sister Agnes, who had stood beside me in that critical moment, became an anchor. Her steady eyes reminded me that I was no longer alone. The bishop returned after several weeks with his decision. We were assembled in the chapel, hearts pounding, breaths caught in our throats. His words were careful, measured, but they struck like lightning. The Mother Superior will be removed from her position. A new leader will be appointed to guide this convent with mercy and justice. Gasps rippled through the sisters. I felt my knees weaken, but this time it was not from fear, it was from release. The weight that had pressed on my chest for so many years began to lift. The Mother Superior's face, pale and rigid, betrayed her fury, but she no longer had the power to lash out. She was escorted away, her footsteps fading like the final notes of a hymn that no one wished to hear again. Yet victory did not feel sweet. It felt complicated, jagged. For even as justice came, scars remained. Many sisters still carried bruises in their hearts, memories they could not erase. Some wept openly, mourning years lost to fear. Others kept their faces stoic, but their silence spoke volumes. I realized then that freedom was not the end of our story. It was only the beginning of a long, painful process of healing. For me, the aftermath meant facing memories I had buried deep. Without her daily cruelty looming, they rose to the surface. The sting of the cane, the echo of harsh words, the loneliness of nights spent trembling in silence. They came like waves crashing against the shore, unrelenting. At times, I wondered if speaking out had truly set me free, or if it had simply unlocked the door to a chamber of pain I had long kept sealed. But in those darkest moments, Sister Agnes reminded me, freedom is not the absence of scars. It is the choice to live despite them. Her words became my guide. Each day I chose to step forward, however faltering my steps. The convent itself began to transform. Walls that had once absorbed our cries now heard laughter, hesitant at first, then bolder. The new leader, a kind woman with gentle hands and steady faith, encouraged us to find our voices again. She urged us to write, to sing, to speak. It was as though a garden long left untended began to bloom once more. Still, I carried the knowledge that rebellion had come at a price. Some sisters had been too afraid to stand with us, and their guilt created distance. Others left the convent entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal they had endured. And I, though I stayed, often questioned whether I truly belonged. One evening, as I watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, I realized the aftermath was not about restoring what had been lost. It was about creating something new. The convent would never be the same, and neither would I. But perhaps that was the gift hidden in tragedy, that from the ruins, something truer could rise. I pressed my palm to the wooden cross that hung at my neck, the same cross I had once clutched in fear, and whispered, "Thank you for giving me the strength to speak." For the first time in years, the prayer did not feel like desperation. It felt like hope. In the quiet that followed her removal, I discovered that freedom is not a doorway you step through once. It is a road you walk, sometimes confidently, sometimes with trembling knees. For a long while I expected healing to arrive like a miracle at the altar, light breaking through stained glass, pain dissolving in a single breath. Instead, it came as a practice. It came in small, faithful steps. The new leader of our convent was gentle in ways that felt almost unfamiliar at first. She spoke softly, but her softness was not weakness. It was strength restrained, strength that refused to harm. She asked me to rest, truly rest, and when I protested that there was too much to do, she smiled and said, "Child, the kingdom is not built on your exhaustion." Those words cracked something open in me. I had been trained to believe that worth was measured in bruises and silence. Now I was learning that worth could be measured in peace. Sister Agnes stayed near. She walked with me through the garden when my chest tightened and the old fear tried to return. She sat beside me in the chapel when prayers turned to tears without warning. She taught me to breathe again, to feel the stone beneath my knees without reliving a punishment, to see the candle's flame without expecting it to burn me. She never asked me to hurry or to forgive before I was ready. She simply witnessed my becoming, as one might watch winter thaw slowly into spring. I began to keep a small notebook, no ledger of sins, no list of failures. I wrote truths I could hold like rosary beads. God is not cruel. My body is not wrong. Obedience is not silence. On difficult days, I traced the lines with my fingertip until they anchored me. Healing, I learned, is repetition with love. Therapy found its way to our convent through a visiting counselor who offered to meet privately with any sister who desired it. I went reluctantly the first time, terrified that speaking the whole of my story would shatter me. It did not. It shook me, yes, but it also steadied me. The counselor helped me untangle the lies braided into my faith, the idea that suffering proves holiness, that a child's pain is a necessary path to God. She taught me to name what happened with simple, unornamented words: abuse, coercion, harm. Naming did not make it worse. Naming returned my voice. As months turned to years, I found myself drawn to the novices, young women arriving with bright eyes and hesitant hands, carrying their own histories of grief and hope. I began to teach them in small ways: how to hem altar cloths without pricking their fingers, how to pace their breath during long chants so the song carries them instead of crushing them, how to say the word no when a boundary is needed, and to trust that heaven is not offended by honest limits. At first I felt unworthy to guide them, but one of the novices said with a shy smile, "Sister, you make God sound like safety." I went to the chapel and wept for a long time after that. Forgiveness came differently than I expected. People speak of it as a doorway. Pass through it and you are free. For me, forgiveness was a field I walked carefully, sometimes stepping forward, sometimes doubling back when the ground felt unsteady. I did not excuse what was done to me. I did not call it discipline or misunderstanding. I called it what it was, and then chose, again and again, not to carry the poison. Some days I could pray for the woman who hurt me. Other days I could only pray for the strength not to hate her. I decided that God could hold the rest. My relationship with obedience changed too. I used to think obedience meant becoming smaller and smaller until I disappeared. Now I understand that obedience means aligning myself with love, even when love requires me to speak a difficult truth. My rebellion did not pull me away from faith, it returned me to it. It stripped away the counterfeit and left me with what is real: mercy, justice, tenderness, and truth. There were nights when the past still ambushed me. Footsteps in a hallway, a raised voice, the echo of a command. On those nights I rose from my bed and went to the chapel. I would light a single candle and sit with its small, steadfast flame. "I survived," I whispered to the dark. "I am here." It felt important to say it aloud, to let the rafters and the silent saints hear. Survival is a prayer, too. In time, I began to speak beyond our walls. A parish invited me to lead a retreat for women who had been wounded by people they trusted. I told my story without graphic details, letting the truth carry its own weight. I watched faces soften, backs straighten, hands reach for tissues and for one another. Afterward, a woman pressed my hands in hers and said, "You gave me the words I needed." I thought of the years I had none and offered her a quiet blessing. The convent has changed. Laughter returns more easily to the refectory. The novices sing in the garden without flinching at sudden noises. We train our leaders with clear expectations and shared authority because power guarded in darkness is dangerous and light is a discipline we practice together. We are not perfect. We will never be beyond the need to examine ourselves. But we are no longer afraid to look. As for me, I keep the small notebook still. I add new truths when I find them. My voice honors God. Rest is holy. Rebellion, rightly named, is simply the refusal to betray the truth. I mentor inquirers who arrive with questions and hope. I tell them that vocation is not a hiding place from pain, but a path to love. And love, in its truest form, does not bruise. If you are listening to me now, and your breath has grown shallow at the thought of your own story, hear this. You are not alone. Whether you sit in a pew or stand in a kitchen, whether you wear a habit or a sweater, whether your wounds are old or fresh, your pain is not proof of God's will, and your silence is not required to be loved. Seek one trustworthy person, speak one true sentence. Let that be your first step. Then another and another. Healing is not quick, but it is possible. I am living proof. Sometimes I visit the old corridor where I once knelt on cold stone, arms lifted until they shook. The light falls differently there now. I run my palm over the place where the broom once clattered, and I thank God, not for the harm, never for the harm, but for the courage that rose inside me like dawn and taught me to name the harm, to refuse it, to rise. I do not know what became of the woman who ruled us with fear. I used to believe I needed that answer to be whole. I do not anymore. My wholeness is not hinged to her repentance or to any verdict rendered in some distant office. My wholeness is the steady work of choosing life each day, choosing truth, choosing gentleness, choosing to set down the weight that was never mine to carry. This is my legacy, not the wounds, but the witness, not the years I lost, but the love I refuse to lose now. If I have any authority, let it be this, to tell you that God's voice does not sound like terror in the night. It sounds like a hand steadying your breath, like a friend sitting beside you, like your own heart learning, slowly and surely, to trust its beat again. And if you ask what rebellion finally meant for me, I will say it plainly. Rebellion was my return to truth. It was the day I chose the light and refused to hand it back. It was the moment I stood, trembling but unbroken, and believed that freedom, even in small steps, is holy. Amen.